And she specializes in doing race equity.
Don't say I know where you're going. Don't say
Welcome to our closing keynote of the 2018 Equity in the Center Summit. I'm excited to see so many of you are still here and you have stuck with us throughout the day. The sessions were very engaging and it's been really rewarding for the team to hear the positive feedback from all of you. So thank you so much for being present and fully engaged and vulnerable and courageous in conversations. So Heather's been doing race equity and racial justice work since 1992, though she does say that it was never her intent to end up in this line of work, like many of us, I think, in this room. And she specializes in doing race equity and racial justice work with white leaders. So we've talked a lot about in the past couple of days how some messages are better heard and received when they are sent within racial groups. And Heather's here to talk to us today about Facing Whiteness. And the way we ended up here on the keynote stage is after Awake to Woke to Work was published in April, Heather sent us a message and said, like, congrats on the publication. Great, would you like to chat? And so we had a call and she was like, I really enjoyed reading the paper. I've sent it to people, but you left something out. Whiteness and the role of white people and white leaders in dismantling white supremacy. And I said, yes, that's accurate. We left a number of things out. We've also been told we left out, anti-Black racism, the origins of intersectionality, and all of those things are true. We were very intentional in crafting the publication, and many people in this room reviewed it. We thought it was important that as many people as possible be able to receive the content. And we agreed with Heather, and we enthusiastically accepted her offer to come and speak to you all today. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Heather Hackman.
okay. Yep, there's the mic. All right. I have my teacher voice on, but I don't think I need it. It's kind of smoking hot in this room. So the conversation that I have just a few minutes to talk about is Facing Whiteness, which is for sure a tricky conversation for a host of reasons, which we'll get into, to be sure. But I just want to acknowledge the challenge of it. And I really want to acknowledge the strategy of like, yes, Heather, yes, we did leave that out. It makes perfect sense. And yet in the long-term strategy, it absolutely has to be talked about or named in some fashion. And so I'm delighted to be here with you. You're not quite my sector. I came out of higher education. So throughout the day, I've been an outsider looking in on your jam and seeing what's going on here. And it's fascinating stuff, I have to say. It's fascinating stuff. A lot of conversation about ecosystems and the ways that those evolve. And I always think it's helpful to have someone outside of your ecosystem to simply say, why are you doing that? And often the answer is, well, we've always done it that way. I'm like, that's fascinating. Why are you still doing it, right? Like, let's talk. And the same is true for higher ed. Tenure process, for sure, is one of the most kind of racist, sexist, gender oppressive, name it, economically unjust dynamics in higher education, but it's loath to change. And why is that? Because it's how it's always been done. And so I always think it's important to have people who are rooted outside of our sector doing work in our sector to help us understand what we might just unconsciously, unintentionally accept as normative. And so I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy and honored to be here. So let's start with a ground in, if you will. If you'll sit with your feet flat on the floor, although that's tough, right? I was on the panel and my feet didn't actually hit the floor earlier today. So I had to scooch up and I did a little toe point. I'm trying to look cool at the same time. I know I didn't, but I don't care. Y'all saw it, and that's fine. So feet flat if you can, sitting as upright as you're comfortable and able. And we all have very different bodies, so don't fall into some kind of normative sense of what's right or wrong here. We're not going to get ableist as we try to ground in for a racial equity conversation. So whatever your body's able to do, it's beautiful, and really love it, So eyes closed or cast your gaze to a neutral site. And we've got countless trauma survivors in the United States. So in your trainings or the meetings or the one-on-ones that you do, it's absolutely not okay to ask folks for whom that's their truth to close their eyes in a public space. So just cast your gaze to a neutral site that's not going to leave you visually distracted. That's the goal. And then breathe as deeply as you're comfortable and able, recognizing that something as benign as a breath is profoundly mediated by race and class in the United States. Only some neighborhoods have trash incinerators put in them. Only some neighborhoods have coal-fired power plants put in them. And so something so simple that we often take for granted, like breathing, is really, really mediated by race and class. And so just for 30 seconds, just ground in to the felt sense of air coming in and out of your nose. Your mind's going to wander. Totally fine, that's what it does. That's what it does. So gently, lovingly, notice it and bring your attention back. What we're doing here is building the muscle of attention and the capacity of presence. Attention and presence, attention and presence. So just for 30 seconds, if you will, let's ground in. And last, inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. If you've been to any of our trainings, you know we do that at the beginning, but all throughout the day, all throughout the day. And so here you are, very quickly, just say a quick hello to the people around you, just so you know who they are. Quick hello, names, quick hello, names. Nice job. Nice job. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. So that really takes 2 minutes, right? At the beginning of every meeting, every department meeting, every staff meeting, every one-on-one, everything you got going on, even before you send that furious email, just take a second to ground in. Just ground in for 30, even 60 seconds. Just breathe. Because you might not want to hit send on that email. And then you're going to spend 20 minutes cleaning it up. So if you take a minute to ground in, you get those 19 back, right? So it's a time saver. But more importantly, if we're not paying attention and if we're not profoundly present, we're going to miss a lot. We're going to miss a lot. And so we have to be so clear and so here when we do this work, as clear and as here as you can be. So grounding in matters, and if we were in a longer training moment, I know it's supposed to be a keynote, but it's actually going to be more like a workshop, so sorry, we didn't talk about that, but that's how it's going to go. In the longer process, we would really tell you more and more about why that matters so much, why it matters so much. So you're just going to have to intuitively know, right? You have to be present, and you have to pay attention, presence and attention. A little bit about myself. I'm 100% no expert on this content. I don't claim to be. You should be very kind of curious about anybody who's a dominant group member and claims expertise. Real mistake. In fact, I was just at a conference in Pittsburgh a couple days ago, and I did have someone who would be read and raised as white, seemed to present as cisgender male, came up in the middle of my little session while people were talking, and he's like, I love what you're doing. I was like, that's great, and he came in late, came up, I love what you're doing, and I know where you're going with this, so I can't stay, because I got other stuff to do. I'm like, that's fantastic, and so he's like, but I support it 100%, and I mean, he even kept that whole thing, and I was like, That's great. That's great. And so, well, I didn't name him or call him out. I even fibbed about it a bit, and I said, I was in a workshop a while ago where this happened. I immediately used that as an example in the workshop of, here's all kinds of things not to do. Not to do. Don't claim expertise. Don't say I know where you're going. Don't say I totally understand where you're coming from, because we're so complex and these issues are so heavy and profound that for dominant group members, that's a very difficult thing to do. So does that mean we shrink in the corner? No, it just means that we right-size ourselves. We right-size ourselves in relationship to this content, right-size ourselves. And so I'm no expert, but let me say very clearly that not a word that comes out of my mouth was an original thought, actually. Not a single word. Is that 4 centuries of First Nations people and people who get read and embraced as people of color in this country have, through lived experience, through academic work, through grassroots organizing, have developed a vast and profound body of knowledge. And so I am merely transmitting a tiny piece of that knowledge in just whatever way I can. But it's so important not to own it, right? It's so important not to say, that's mine, that's mine. And this little session goes from really basic concepts to a bit more depth, and we're going to do this work in relationship. And so that's the other piece that you did, is you connected with each other. You connected, like, what's up? And it's really important to say, how are you? And not do a US how are you, like, hey, how are you? Not that, but like, how are you today? If I can't find 3 minutes to do that, then what is the quality of my social justice work, really? If I really can't do that, then what's the point on some level? What's the point? So really take a minute just to say, I actually do want to know how you're doing today. Do want to know. So just some basic opening pieces here. Here's some common missteps. Let's move through these, kind of get them out of the way, if you will, around this conversation about whiteness. One common misstep is a lack of same language, same frame. And that's not because people are awful, it's because no information, no training, no education, et cetera. Working with a large government agency out west, and they were talking about race, racism, and whiteness, and some of their white folks were like, how dare you call me white? I'm like, that's funny, like, that's kind of funny. I get it. I get why you're scared, because you see it as an attack, but I'm white. Like, I live in Minnesota. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Las Vegas, but I've lived in Minnesota for 18 years, and in the wintertime, white people get translucent. I mean, we're white. We're white. You can see us from space. We're that white. I mean, wow. And so that's just a fact. That's just a matter of course, right? And so why did that person have that reaction? A whole host of reasons. Privilege, a whole host of reasons of wanting status quo, et cetera, but also a lot of misinformation that even the term whiteness means that I'm attacking you as an individual white person. Even the term white supremacy means I think you're a white supremacist, and those are very different things. Institutional, structural, historic white supremacy versus the person who's on the ground doing that, right? And so we lack same language, same frame, but around race issues in general, but particularly around whiteness. A second common misstep in organizations that we work with, whether they're nonprofits or philanthropic, is a vast overestimation of knowledge in the orgs we go to, which are historically and majority white. We don't tend to be invited into really racially complex spaces. At least I don't. Other folks in our group do. But I tend to be invited, and some colleagues I train with in our group, into historically majority white spaces. And when we do an assessment there, we do a Likert, and then we do some open-ended questions. And many of the white folks in that organization, if there's 40 people in the training, let's say, and there's 37 of them are white, many of them will say, on a scale of 0 to 5, what's your knowledge of race? And they're like, I'm pretty sure I'm a 4. I'm like, that's awesome. This is going to make a great training. And then as we look at the open-ended questions, maybe 2 people answered it correctly. 2 people knew what race actually was. But the way we understand that, it's not like you're stupid, blah, 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 blah. But if you grew up in a family of couch sitters, let's say, generations of couch sitting, really lots of ritual and history around couch sitting, even a little bit of pride around couch sitting, and then you go to a conference and you go to a workshop about block walking and the benefits of walking around the block, and you go home to your family and you say, I'm walking around the block. And they're like, what? We are couch sitters. You're like, no, I'm not going to do it. I read a book by Tim Wise about block walking, and I'm going to go block walk. And they're like, well, we don't, blah, 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 how dare you? And you're out there and you're hitting that block. You're just doing it against all odds, right? And then some days you're like, I'm going 2 just to show. And you do 2 blocks. Compared to the setting you came out of, you are killing it in your workout. I mean, you are just nailing this thing. It's incredible. And then if you go to different conferences, maybe, you meet a triathlete. And you realize you have that moment of, oh, that moment where you realize, oh my gosh, oh my goodness. And so what we tend to find is that many historically majority white organizations have been semi-couch sitting or couch sitting for a long time. And so a mere tepid, like we love diversity, we care about racial equity, we're against racism, that seems like it's so far out there. Now, is it different than couch sitting? 100%. So I'm not interested in shaming that. What I'm interested in is saying, let's get our work to scale. And what we need in this particular moment is a whole room of triathletes. That's what we need, is an entire room of triathletes. So it doesn't mean that organization should be shamed. It just means, dear friends, we're going to give you a more rigorous workout. And so here's a workout regime. This isn't working. I don't know what I'm doing, but that's not a workout. But we're going to give you more stuff to do. We're going to give you more stuff to do internally, interpersonally, institutionally, and structurally. We're going to help you understand your role and what you need to do on those levels. And so the second major problem we see in historically majority white nonprofits or foundations is a vast overestimation of knowledge, not because they're bad people, just because it's like, yeah, I grew up with the couch sitters. You combine that with a lack of deep knowledge, meaning intentional miseducation from our P12 system, and now you're in a world of hurt. Now you're in a world of hurt because our P12 education system, and I was in teacher ed for a very long time. I taught teachers how to teach, and I taught social justice education for teachers. That means that not only is there a lack of knowledge, but there's actually a whole body of misinformation that has to be uprooted. And so that means you have to learn your history, you have to understand systems, you're going to have to let go of a lot of pet ideas that you've held for a long time. Another piece, it's a common misstep, is confusing liberalism for justice. And I don't mean to offend anybody in this room, but we do quite a bit of work in the Seattle area, Pacific Northwest. And Seattle's very much like Minneapolis, but a little more explicit. If I had hair long enough, you'd get it, but they're like, we're Seattle, like that kind of jam. And I'm like, I love it. I love Seattle. I love you. And you've got some real problems around race. And so liberalism again can get confused for justice. And so justice means that you're naming racism, and you're naming whiteness at the same time in equal proportion. And so you're calling out white privilege and white supremacy and whiteness and the white racial narrative in your practices, policies, procedures, and programs. You're looking at it in the interstitial tissue of your organization. You're really naming it. And so there's no doubt that Seattle's done some great work around racial justice in terms of how it affects communities of color and Native communities. King County, as a larger entity, has also been doing some really phenomenal work. And I love Matthias. And I've been doing work in King County for 3 years now. And they are just getting to the point where they can really name whiteness and white privilege. It took them a while, and it took a lot of effort, and it took a lot of leadership, but they're doing it, and they realize as they look back, that's not the same as what they used to be doing. So they're growing, and so yay for King County, and yay for the city of Seattle. And the last piece that's a common misstep is risk aversion, and really just wanting to maintain privilege. And I think it's one of the most challenging elements of talking about whiteness, is that many really committed white people want racism to end, and don't want a single resource in my life to change, And so I want that to change, but I don't want my life to change. Like somehow magically that can happen, and it can't. But please don't understand that change as deficit, because colleagues of color were articulating in ways. I'm pointing to a panel that what used to be behind me are articulated, because you're like, what is she doing, stretching? No, there were people up here a while ago, and there were some folks of color who were talking about liberation in really profound ways. And that liberation is not just for Native folks and folks of color. The liberation is for white people too. There is something to be had, which is part of what we'll talk about today. So what you want to do is cultivate some dispositions around this. Instead of guilt, shame, and blame, you actually want to get into a sense of curiosity, empathy, humility, and love. Camera person, is it okay if I move just a bit up and down the aisle? Or okay, all right. I grew up in Vegas, so the temptation to go hello is pretty high. It's pretty high. And so, I just love microphones. And so, But here's the thing, if you just say to somebody, don't be guilty, what are they going to do? That's like saying, don't think about the Eiffel Tower. Right. And you're like, oh, what a fine structure. You know, like you immediately start thinking about the Eiffel Tower. So what we need to do instead is get curious about why we don't know what we don't know. Don't take it as an attack. Take it as an opportunity, an invitation to get curious about it. And instead of getting all heady, come from your heart. One of the ways we face whiteness is by having a whole body experience here. So it's not just about intellectualizing some kind of dynamic of racial oppression. It's about understanding what my role is in that and how it lands on my body, how it lands in my body. One of the questions we ask in trainings, the longer ones, particularly more advanced ones, is where do you hold your race in your body? And we ask people to ground into that. And you would think skin would be the answer. It's rarely ever the answer. And white people often talk about a rigidity. And they hold their whiteness rigidly in their spine. Or some people say, it's in my throat because I know I should say something and I can't quite get it out. This choking sensation starts. I'm like, that's so real. That's so real. What do we need to do to work through that? Because it's so important that you say stuff when you need to say it. So empathy, bringing our hearts to this experience, bringing our whole selves to it, having some humility, and that means just saying you don't know. So we're creating an environment where white people have to get curious, bring our hearts to this conversation, really, really say what we don't know and be willing to learn. And not in an arrogant way saying you're humble. I was working with potentially going to work with an environmental org with a white woman as the executive director. We were talking, and she's like, but one of my greatest strengths in terms of leadership is my humility. And I went, well, that's a fine quality, you know, like, that's great. That is great, you know, so it didn't quite click, right? It didn't quite click. But the last thing I want to talk about in terms of dispositions, how are we going to create a space that allow white people to lean hard into this, to really face whiteness? White majority, historically white organizations to say, nope, we're going to take this on, is really just fierce, deep, unapologetic love. Like, I will not apologize for knowing in my soul that love at the end of this, that is the goal. I will not apologize for a minute for just loving bell hooks like nobody's business, and her whole book all about love. I mean, let's give it up for bell hooks for real. For real. If you're watching, hey, Belle. And so I've met her twice, and both times I was like, oh, I hope I say something smart and make her think. And both times I was like, huh. And that was it. That's all that came out. Because she's so insightful and such a sage and one of the best thinkers of our time, to be sure. And she says, you want to know what this is about? This is about love, but not Hallmark love, not conditional love, not even, transactional love, to be sure. It is about that unremitting, unapologetic desire for peace in our souls. And it's one of the most loving things we can do for each other. So dismantling a system that is this toxic is one of the greatest gifts we can give this country. It has been a wound for far too long. So heal this, heal this. So we avoid the stoppers in majority historically white organizations and facing whiteness by giving something else to do, something else to think about. And then, so here's a really basic concept, is that many majority historically white organizations that really want to begin or say they want to begin to talk about whiteness, they're deeply confused about diversity, cultural competency, and equity and social justice. They are three separate concepts. They are not a developmental sequence. Many organizations are like, we're going to start with diversity and work our way into equity. I'm like, that's amazing. But let's think about it this way. I say that a lot, I guess. Let's think about it this way. If diversity is oranges and cultural competency or cultural authenticity or culturally relevant pedagogy, if that's grapes and equity and social justice are apples, it is profoundly illogical to put oranges in the recipe if what you want is an apple pie. And oranges never develop into apples. You can leave them in your kitchen for a long time. You can keep checking on them, like turn on the light, no, and they'll never become apples. And so if you want to do this work, you've got to be in equity and social justice for three main reasons. One, it's the only one of these three that does talk about systems and history. Number two, it's the only one that therefore has really lucid and explicit conversations about access to resources, power, and privilege. And number three, it's the hopeful one. So we do quite a bit of work in higher ed, and higher ed presidents love diversity. They're like, we love Diversity Week, and they bring in big speakers, feed everybody, amazing food, everybody's really full, really inspired. Come Monday, back to business as usual. Back to business. Why? Because the first two lead to zero structural change. It's not their fault. They're not designed to do that. So we don't even talk about diversity. We drop that altogether. Where do you put diversity and inclusion as concepts then? It's not a process, but as concepts, where could they fit? And we frame them as outcomes of equity and social justice work. If you want a more racially diverse, a racially inclusive campus, nonprofit, foundation, then you will do equity and social justice work to get to that outcome, right? And so this conversation, what we first do is we move majority historically white organizations who want to face whiteness into this far right column, and then we remind them it's a lens, not a list. It's a lens, not a list. And what's the checklist? Give me the 3 steps to racial equity. And I was like, oh, superstar. Number 1, don't you think we would have done that by now if there was a list? Like, logic would dictate. Number 2, even if I had it, I wouldn't give it to you because it's not about the list. It's about the capacity to engage in it. So it's about the creation of a lens, a deep and profound lens, not that first gets expressed outward, but that gets immediately turned on myself. Immediately turned on myself. And the flow of this is some level setting concepts talking about race, then racism, then whiteness. Notice that whiteness is the 4th module out of the 5 module series that we train organizations on and we help them use to develop policies, practice, procedures, and programs that are imbued with racial justice. It's the 4th one. And so if we're facing race through a racial equity, racial justice lens, what are we exactly facing? History and systems will lead us in the process of facing these things. Diversity and cultural competency won't, but understanding history and systems around race, racism, and whiteness will lead us to these inevitable landing points. Number 1, deep questions about resources. Number 2, deep societal questions. What has happened here? Number 3, going a little deeper, moral questions, profound moral questions. Underneath that, spiritual questions in whatever way you choose to define that. You can define it any way you want. And then the deepest human questions, the kind of existential pieces that just get shredded with the existence of systems of racial oppression. And so, if we are going to begin to ask these questions, let's look at some concepts here. Part of facing whiteness is really understanding, first and foremost, that this is about resources. The top questions that organizations have to ask when facing whiteness is the question of resources. So how do we help people understand that? If my Uncle Al, I love him so much. I hope he's not watching this, because he thinks I'm a lawyer, so I'm sure he's not. I'm sure he's not. 83 years old. And as he gets older, he's shrunk, so he's almost my size right now, which I think is so fantastic, because eyeball to eyeball. And he's a profound guy, because he's the most racist, sexist, homophobic Democrat you're ever going to meet. He loves MSNBC, but he yells at it all the time, because it makes him so furious. The only other channel he watches is the Golf Channel, which also infuriates him somehow. I don't know what he's mad about, but he's yelling at the Golf Channel, he's yelling at MSNBC, blah, 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 blah. And if I were to start to talk about these issues with Al, he would immediately personalize it. Immediately be like, what are you talking about? It's not about me. I'm a good guy. I'm like, I know, Al. I love you. Despite all the goofy other stuff, I do love you. I do love you so much. I come see you every year. We hang out. We go, all that stuff. That's why you don't start at the individual level. You start at the systems level and work your way down. So you learn systems to individual and you act from individual to systems. So if I understand this from a big picture and then how that lands on me, it's very similar to understanding a weather system and how that weather system actually informs whether I need an umbrella or not. And then I act by whether I choose to use an umbrella and think about what can I do around climate change, right? Because climate's not weather, but climate change is absolutely influencing our weather. And in this very moment, as we're sitting in this room, the people in the Florida Panhandle and that surrounding area are being hit by a Category 4 hurricane. And what we know about the effects of climate change is that the worst and the first impacts are always to the most vulnerable people. So as we're sitting in this room talking about racial equity in ways that are rather comfortable, please don't think for a moment that millions of people's lives are being literally shredded right now. The roofs are literally being torn off of their lives. And climate is not a separate issue from racial justice, gender justice, or economic justice, because if you think about this current climate moment that has been driven by the Anthropocene, this is a side note, it's not on the slide, so hang in there with me. Then we look at how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, you just look at the last 6 centuries of Western civilization and how we have exported that globally. And in those 6 centuries, the mindset around gender has been deeply misogynist, patriarchal, and violent against women. Women were to be owned and dominated and controlled. And then when you frame nature in the feminine form, nature is also to be owned and dominated and controlled. Layer on top of that a linear extraction system through the lens of class oppression, of take, also known as colonization, also known as imperialization, neoliberal politics and economies, endless extraction. And then layer on top of that 4 centuries of white supremacy saying, we are the superior race of people, do not question our stewardship of this planet. And so if you have violence against nature, endless linear extraction, and an unwillingness to look at how we have operated for several centuries, of course we're in this climate moment. So that's a tangent. If you lost me, come back. And so, back to Al. So if I were to talk to Al about this on a personal level, he'd be like, why are you attacking me? So we go up to systems, and from the system level, every form of oppression works exactly the same way. Dominant groups pressing down on subordinate groups using institutional and cultural power. For what purpose? The purpose is to deny resources and extract resources. So this conversation about whiteness is first a conversation about resources, non-material and material. And so let me explain that a little bit more. Imagine, and you can see, like, that looks like she drew that. The answer is yes, I did. I could hardly be bothered to figure out PowerPoint, so I'm like, whoop, and load it up. And so I did draw this, and I drew all the other ones too. And so imagine this clear glass tube, U-shaped tube, as our entire society. And in it, you pour every resource necessary for a healthy and thriving society. Good schools, good transportation, good access to jobs, food access, like real healthcare access, the things that make people thrive and healthy. And everyone in the United States is swimming around grabbing a little bit of that. Notice that equity says not everybody has to have the same, but everybody should have enough. Everybody should have enough. And so while I really appreciate the work the city of Seattle is doing and King County is doing, you also can't help but notice that it's one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, and it has an extraordinary challenge in terms of people experiencing homelessness. And one statistic I read a while back said they have the highest per capita rate of people experiencing homelessness in the United States, and they are one of the wealthiest cities in this country. And so something is not working there. Something's not working there. So while everybody gets enough to be healthy and thriving, not everybody has to have the same. Not everybody has. That'd be amazing if we had that, but we don't. We have a society that's ruthlessly divided along lines of race, where people of color and Native people live on one side of the tracks, white people are on the other side of the tracks. The key about the racial barrier here is that it is impermeable to people, but permeable to resources. So people can't get in, but resources can flow. Third quarter of 2011, unemployment for black folks in Minneapolis, 24%. Unemployment rate for white folks, 6%. If the narrative in your white liberal mind is lazy, uneducated, don't want to work, right? The George Herbert Walker Bush and the Bill Clinton presidential campaign's portrayal of black folks, right? If that's your narrative, and your narrative, the story that you unconsciously, unintentionally hold as a white liberal is honest, rugged individual, hardworking, blah, 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 white people, then those narratives will explain away those numbers. So you'll still feel bad about it, and you might have a desire to do something, but what you won't see is the system of racism and the system of whiteness. Because 6% was below the national average at that time. And so the purpose of this division is not merely to divide our society. The purpose of this division and the role of these narratives is actually to justify and explain away. So now superimpose the pressing down on the left side of the tube and seal it up in all the ways the lives of Native people and people of color are. Police lives, restricted housing, restricted access to education and jobs really hem in the lives, the way that the system of racism hems in the lives of Native people and people of color. So it's actually like a plunger on that side of the tube, and the white side is open. So as you do what we just talked about, the pressing down by default, and this is why I like this little image that I developed for students at the university I was at, because the physics just explains how structural racism works. As you seal it up and press down, the blue line drops to the green, resources flow through, and the blue line lifts to the green. So what we actually have in the United States is a transactional system of racial oppression. And this is a hard pill for white people to swallow in facing whiteness, because every resource that is denied or taken from Native people and people of color goes to the white side of the tube. It doesn't just disappear. And so I always bring books with me. Take the professor out of the classroom, but you're not going to take the classroom out of the professor. And so Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, talking about redlining in the United States. That wasn't happenstance, first of all. But second of all, the houses didn't disappear. They just became more available to the one group that's left, right? And that is the purpose. The purpose of racism is not because this country just can't figure out how to not hate Native people and people of color. The purpose of racism, why we have spent trillions of dollars on the war on drugs, to have really no difference in drugs in the United States, but to have a reinstatement of the racial hierarchy in the United States, why we have spent trillions on it, is because white people get something out of it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not painting white people as a group, as this horrible, awful group of people, because I don't see myself as a horrible, awful person. And I understand I fully benefit. In this room, I have benefited from the toll that Native people and people of color, the toll that racism has taken on the lives of Native folks and folks of color in this room. Like, it's not an abstract thought, it's my relationship to you. I know that. I know that. Not going to guilt, shame, and blame. I'm going to get real curious about what? That is not okay with me. That is not okay with me. So I'm not saying that white people are white supremacists. What I'm saying is white people have been born into a system and history that has played out for a long time, so much so that it seems normal. And that's the challenge with white folks who do not necessarily have a commitment to this work, and I just made the numbers of 40 up, minus 40 to plus 40, is that many white people in the United States, particularly if we've been here for a long time, have been socialized to believe that the green line on our side of the tube is ground zero. And that's why so many white folks will say, anytime you move for racial equity, to not reverse it, but to just get back to the blue line. So many white people will have a visceral reaction of saying, you are taking something away from me. I've earned everything I've got. I've worked for this moment. You have to give me this opportunity because I have worked my tail off. Proven record of, is anybody following what I'm, okay, so, we have to get more specific, but the challenge is that not only will I say it, I'll believe it. It's not an obtuse defense. I really believe it. Now, have I worked hard for the things in my life? Of course I have. I have. I'm a fairly hardworking human. And is white privilege always just a bit of a breeze at my back? Absolutely, always. There's never a day it's not. There's never a minute it's not. And so our challenge in facing whiteness first is to disrupt the story of what it means to be white in this country and offer a different story. Offer a different story. And the challenge of this is that many folks will say, well, it's your story versus mine, except that's why I always travel with books, because I've got exact laws that were made, exact policies that have been enacted, exact moments, exact leadership, exact bipartisan moves that did this specific thing. And so while we can have different opinions, I've actually got fact on my side. I've got information on my side. So, facing whiteness, resource questions. It was mentioned in the keynote yesterday that this is decolonizing wealth, that it's really a theft. And now you're like, oh, are you calling me a thief, blah, 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 blah. No, I'm saying I've inherited goods that were stolen. Which is why I really strongly favor reparations and making amends. I've got a number of people in my life that I love fiercely who are in recovery programs and have struggled with drugs and alcohol for a very long time. And if I understand a 12-step program correctly, that step in there where you make amends doesn't say, just go back and say, hey, sorry about all that. No. That's not what it says. It's a 3-step process to say, I know I was wrong, and here's the ways I think I've harmed you, and what can I do to set it right? What can I do to set it right? So foundations would be wise to recognize that so much of that philanthropic dollar base did not come from hard work alone. It actually came from extraordinary dynamics of race and class privilege, whiteness and owning classness. And therefore, if I know that, then when I move that money, instead of thinking of it as a grant, maybe I would think of it as a return of something that has been taken. A return. And I'm committed to that. I'm committed to that. Not because I want to sound like a... Woke is such a challenging word, right? Because white people have taken that out of context and put a period and are like, I'm woke. You know, and like there's a badge for it. But the communities of color who started that conversation, that is not a period moment. It's like, whoa, it's in process, right? It's about a process of becoming. But in my white mind, it's like, oh, is there a certificate for that? You know, like we want some evidence of it. And so notice what I'm talking about here is I don't look at my white colleagues and say, we're thieves. I look at my white colleagues and explain the theft this way. We've inherited a system that profoundly violates our deepest beliefs. It also violates who we are as a nation. And so if I stole Kay's bag, and then built an empire, and 4 centuries later said, I just want to honor Kay's bag. There's a super good chance she'd be like, give me my crap back too, you know, like, give me my bag back. And so there is something to be had there. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but there is something to be had in responding in a way that is far, far more aligned with what's actually happening here. The second piece, kind of looking at this list, societal questions, is that this tube dynamic is fundamentally undemocratic and it's fundamentally unsustainable. It will break the bank. We have spent, as I said, trillions of dollars since October of '82 to now on the war on drugs. That is trillions of dollars that white working class people could have had for healthcare, for education. That is trillions of dollars that white people who also lost their home in the crash of 2007 and 8 that would have supported them. That is money that isn't just directed to Native folks and folks of color, but white people would have benefited from a national infrastructure that had said, we're gonna care about the most vulnerable people. Like Dean Spade in his work around reform in the prison industrial complex says, you want to get to change in a hurry? Put the needs of transgender women of color in the middle of your policy work, and then guess what? Everyone else gets served. Everyone else gets helped. Everyone will benefit from that. And so if we believe in a democracy, then we have to get rid of the tube model, not just racism, but whiteness, the system of white privilege as well. If we want a society that's sustainable, we actually have to get rid of this system as well, because we can't keep putting inputs. Like that's why the plunger works as well, because you can't just let it sit there, because it'll pop up. You actually have to keep putting energy into pushing it down. That means all of our national resources keep putting into systems of oppression, whether it's race or gender or class or disability or queerness or religious oppression. I mean, think about it. If you add them all up, it's like, wow, that is a pile of energy that this society is putting to maintain these systems that in the short run benefit dominant groups. In the long run, again, we will all go down because of this. Moral questions, it's profoundly corrosive morally. It's hard to say with a straight face some of the things that are being said about the United States when we know it's such a morally corrosive thread. That's why the action of Moral Mondays is so powerful, right? Because it's a reclamation of a compass, of a true north, to say, wait. Spiritual questions were profoundly misaligned, whatever that means for you in terms of spiritual. I'm not going to get into it, but you know, having a belief in one place and having a spiritual kind of idea in another place and having my actions be over here, that misalignment means that we're often quite disassociated from the moment we're in. And then our deepest human questions, one of the challenges of whiteness is that it leaves you so alone, so profoundly alone. And I'll get into that in just a moment because I don't have much more. But it really is a powerful piece, not just for whiteness, but all systems of dominance. Chuck Collins wrote a book, Born on Third Base, really good book for those of you in philanthropy, because he's quite explicit about what the jam is in philanthropy. He's a great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, Oscar Mayer, Wiener, that guy, right? And he gave all his money away in his late 20s, and he's been working for economic justice for decades now. Chuck Collins, born on third base. And he tells this story. He's a good storyteller. He tells the story where an owning class man, extraordinary wealth, was having some big event, and he just had kind of been progressively isolated in his own life. And a woman who was working the event asked him a question, and she touched his elbow or something like that. Such a simple gesture. And he was so shocked because no one had touched him in a long time. No one shakes his hand. No one hugs him. He himself had this awakening, like, what has happened to me? What has this wealth done? And money's not the problem, as Edgar said, it's the lens through which we use resources. And so he just shifted the way he used his resources and distributed them very differently, and he feels so much more human as a result of it. And so these are the questions we land on in terms of facing whiteness and racial justice. As I said, we have to make some amends here, not out of guilt and shame, but out of a desire to be free. Not out of guilt and shame, but out of a desire to be whole. Not out of guilt and shame, but a desire to set that which is wrong and continues to plague us as a community of people. Societal justice means we have to shift how we lead. And I was having a conversation over lunch with some folks at the table, and we were talking about, do you invest a lot of money in helping white leadership kind of wake up to this, or do we switch leaders out? I said, why don't you do both? Why don't you actually really aggressively put Native people and people of color in positions of leadership and decision making, but don't tell the white people, I don't know, go work somewhere else. Instead, create a new position of insider group work, vice president, or something like that, and let those white people get the training they need and then turn and pivot and work with other white people. And those are the spaces that I go into because they're quite challenging, and many of my colleagues of color and Native colleagues are like, I just can't today. Can you go? I'm like, I'll go do it. Sure, I'll do it. And I said on the panel, I'm so happy Jackson Katz is in spaces that are male dominant. I'm like, boop, 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 good job, Jackson. Go in there and deal with the intensity of that space because I'm actually not up to it right now. And so there is a utility for white people working with other white people. And so yes, train up those leaders, but don't have them hold the CEO or the executive director position while you're training them up. Slide them over to vice president of inside group work and efficacious change with the dominant group, vice presidency, and then let someone else lead, right? You've got two things happening. One is getting everybody to wake up who's in the dominant group to come along, and the second piece is having a vision of what could be. And it seems like it's not the best use of resources, money, energy, and time of Native people and people of color to have to educate white folks. The best use of that is vision. Vision. Like, I love the 3 women who founded Black Lives Matter, and I will follow them everywhere. If they're like purple socks, I'm like, okay. I will do it. I don't know why we're doing this, but I bet they do, and on I go buying stock in purple sock companies. I just go to town. And so I do think that leadership in our societal sectors, it can be really profound if we're quite intentional and strategic about shifting leadership through the lens of racial justice, not eliminating white leadership, but just giving white people something else to do. That's quite profound and important. Moral truth, we have to tell the truth. And Edgar mentioned yesterday dimensions of the mind, body, and spirit that get colonized. And so if we're going to decolonize, if we're going to work for racial justice, we actually have to start telling the truth. Tell the truth. It's not westward expansion. It was colonization and genocide. Just tell the truth about it. And I tell the truth. I don't feel guilty about it. I feel deeply alarmed. How have I participated in that without even knowing? And what do I need to do to make sure I don't do that anymore? I'm just alarmed. So tell the truth. And what starts to happen is I do decolonize my mind. And as a white person, my world has expanded significantly. Spiritually, work from a place of compassion. And I was on a silent meditation retreat for a week a while back. Oh, that was awesome. I was like, it's going to be so quiet. It's going to be great. And as soon as we all got quiet, my head was like, it was just an absolute nightmare. And so it was like I don't know what was happening in my head. Just, and I wanted to speak, and I couldn't. And so I was like, okay, and I'm going to open my eyes. And then, of course, in true fashion of what it means to be kind of white, fat, blah, blah, I start comparing my posture to other people. So now I'm competitively meditating at a retreat. It was horrible. That was just the first 20 minutes, so it was a long week. It was a long week. Oh, my God. But one of the head teacher at that retreat, Spring Washam, who I really bow to that woman. She's deep and profound. She said, compassion doesn't mean condone, but it does mean that we draw our circle as wide as possible and we cast no one out of our heart. And the whole room was like, no one? You know, like, right? And she's like, and nobody said anything because it's a silent retreat, but she said, I know what you're thinking. And the answer is no one. No one. You cast no one out of your heart. And I just was like, oh, vertical learning curve, right? And so, but I understood over time, because there were moments where my head got quiet, and I could understand, like, I have some compassion for you, and compassion doesn't mean condoning, but it means I will intervene with love, with a fierceness, not because I want you to do what I want, but because I can see how your actions are harming you too. And I want to say, oh, dear friend, this is hurting you. This is hurting you. Can I help you? Can I help you with a different lens? And then lastly, our fullest humanity gets met. What do we face when we face whiteness? And what do we face in terms of whiteness when we work through the lens of racial justice? Is that we reconnect with each other because we're fundamentally interdependent. We're mammals. We are connected to each other. You know, more recent research says the EM field of our nervous system extends about 3 feet off our body. If you're within 6 feet of anybody right now, you're picking up on what science calls their juju, right? And, you know, very scientific term, but you're picking up on who they are and where they're at right now. And so we're accountable for that. And in so many ways, we don't even pay attention to it. But when we're rooted in real racial justice and we're decolonizing, we're getting this stuff out, we actually start to pay attention and connect to that. And what a gift. What a gift. Makes us a better parent, better partner, better colleague. Because I'll walk by your cubicle and I'll sense that something's wrong. And I'll come back and I'll say, hey, how you doing today? And you might have that moment where you're like, I'm amazed you asked that question because I'm having a hard day. And if you don't think that's true, you have probably had this experience where you're at some kind of family event in some fashion, you're cleaning up, you're taking stuff into the kitchen, you're like, whoa, and you just come back later because you don't know what's happening in there, but you could feel something was going on. That's what I'm talking about. And that is our natural disposition. We do need each other. Emotionally, spiritually, we do need each other. Rugged individualism is a myth. It's a powerful element of the white racial narrative, but it's not true. And I would have students say, I got here all by myself. I was like, do you have student loans? Yes, I do. Whose tax dollars put money into those coffers so that you could have some student loans? And who wrote the book? And who printed the book? And whose hands made the lunch this morning? Who built and carpeted this room? Like on and on and on and on and on. Like, you didn't do all this. You got yourself here. Good job. I'm delighted you're here. But you needed everyone else who made this space in order to be able to be here. So we're profoundly interdependent, and one of the things that whiteness does is it just keeps cutting us off from each other. And so I'll say one more bit here, get in the boat, and then one last slide, and then we're done, is that my process, I did not start like, oh gosh, I didn't come out and say, hey, clean me up, cut the cord, and I'm in for racial justice. That is not what happened to me. It's not even close, not even close. Although I do probably think I was a little irritated about gender, like, how come he's the doctor? You know, like, I'm sure I said that at 2 minutes old, like, I don't like this situation, but I'm gonna be a doctor, damn it, you know, so all that. But what happened to me is I got heavily socialized into this, and somewhere around 8 or 9 years old, my stepfather is a white man, had a whole bunch of personal challenges in his life, and so anger often came up as a way to express that. It was unskillful, but it was the only tool he had. And he was quite racist, and so we were out in the carport one day and doing something, and I had a very difficult time getting really one kind word from this man. But then he said a racist joke, and I laughed, and he praised me for it. And so I was like, oh. And then I started saying my own racist jokes, and he praised me even more. But this is why I did it, because he backed off a little bit. He wasn't always so angry with me all the time. And so I learned to navigate his violence by using racism as my out. I'm not saying that's okay by any stretch, but I'm telling you that when you're trying to survive that moment, I was using whatever I could to manage it. I'd love to tell you that when he left my life, I stopped doing that, but I didn't, because I noticed that you can leverage racism as a white person in subtle ways and gain favor from teachers, from coaches, from principals, from club advisors, on and on and on. So I didn't come to this work like, oh yeah, I've got a racial justice lens. One of the folks in the panel this morning came from an organizing family, and I felt this visceral response of, that's profound. Like, I really appreciate that experience. That was not mine. It's been a very different road getting here. Horribly stupid things said in my undergrad in Los Angeles, of all places. Not a great place to not know what you're talking about race. And then challenge. And what happened to me is I don't consider myself woke, not even close, to be honest with you. I consider myself someone who's deeply committed and concerned about racial justice issues, and I'm doing my best to get out of the way, to get my own whiteness out of the way. And what happened in the process is that white liberalism will have you standing safely on the shore as a white person, chanting good tidings and cheering the cheers as Native people and people of color row against the tide of racial oppression. And you'll have all the right yard beach signs, and you'll be cheering on, and and you've got the t-shirt on, you're catapulting food out to the boat, and you're like, go rowers, yes, end racism. But I'm always safe and dry on the shore, huh? Like, I've risked nothing. More importantly, though, for me, I've changed nothing. So what this really means is kick our shoes off as white people as we face whiteness, swim out to the boat, get in the boat, and row alongside Native people and people of color. Make this a relational, lived, lifelong commitment, and row. Couple caveats, though. When you get in the boat, don't name the boat after ourselves. Don't do that. We do that a lot? The answer is no. No. Don't stick a flag in the boat and say you just discovered a boat. Don't do that. And more recently, please don't give feedback to the people of color and Native people who are rowing. Just row. And here's the liberation. If you are a historically majority white organization, you're wondering what's in it for you, here's the liberation. Eventually, white people will get the rhythm, and we'll look over at the shore, and we'll notice something. We'll think to ourselves, that's an incredibly small patch of shore. Like, how did I think that was my whole life? How did I think that's all there was? I didn't see the trees back there. I didn't even see the mountain range back there. That's a long shoreline. How did I think that this very small, highly circumscribed and orchestrated space was all that there was? And so swimming to the boat is a rite of passage. It is liberation for white people because we look back and we see a much bigger world, a much more profound life, and we actually get to see that and experience that and even grieve the years we've spent on that patch of shore with Native people and people of color who are like, we know. We've always known that about you. You're the ones who didn't know, but we've always known. We've always known it's hurt you too. And so the task here is not to save Native folks and folks of color. The task for facing whiteness is for white people to get in the boat and stay. We're not going to be perfect. We'll fall out, soaking wet, get back in, okay, keep rowing. Eventually, Native folks and folks of color will scoot over and be like, I bet she'll come back, and I climb back in, seaweed all over me, like, sorry about that, and I get back in, and I just keep rowing. Just keep rowing. And so what does that mean? That means that we join the effort for racial justice. We don't demand that Native people and people of color do it our way. We do it the ways that Native folks and folks of color are saying, this is what will heal our communities. We don't create spaces for POC Native folks at our leadership table. Maybe we need to leave the table and vacate the space. But we don't crowd over and say, we'll let you in. We create very different leadership structures. And the path then leads to freedom. I will be much more free. I have been more free. Not just around race, but in terms of gender and other issues, I feel much more whole. We will have a society that is rooted in peace. We can be who we say we are as a nation, but here's the treat for philanthropy. You also get to be who you say you are. If you really are who you say you are, you have to start doing your business differently. Not out of shame and guilt and blame, but out of a deep, profound, fierce love and commitment to setting this right. And that means listen to Native people and people of color, take leadership from Native people and people of color, and really surrender our ties to whiteness that runs so deep we don't even know. It's a lifelong journey, but it's so worth it. It's worth it individually, interpersonally, but it's incredibly important and worth it for your organizations if you're going to be effective and if you're going to stay relevant in a 21st century United States. I want to end where I began, which is none of this is really anything I thought of. I really want you to hear that. It's not false humility, oh shucks, it's really important that you understand Native people and people of color have been saying this to you for decades upon decades and centuries upon centuries. And so my invitation is listen, deeply and profoundly listen, and we will heal this together. Okay, thank you very much.
It's a different experience for me as a person of color to hear a white person talk about how to get free. There are a lot of us who are in this work because you want to see your people free, you want to see other people free, but it's just profoundly meaningful to know that a person from the dominant group can share in that liberation and work for it among their own people. So thank you. And I do hope that one day we all get free. Before we close, I'm going to welcome Christelle Caballero Saucido from Borealis Philanthropy to the stage for a brief announcement before we close.
All right, I don't know how I can follow that, but I have some news to share. Borealis Philanthropy, which I don't know if some of you are familiar with us, we're a philanthropic intermediary that works nationally. We have a collaborative fund called Racial Equity Accelerating Change. And we just announced an RFLOI. We are trying to support racial equity practitioners who are working on helping nonprofit sector advance in the racial equity journey. We're supporting their growth and trying to create a community of practice. But if you have any questions, I'll also be on the side if you have any other questions too. But thank you.
One reason we're all here assembled today is because Equity in the Center has funding from Borealis Philanthropy. We, along with a number of other change partners who are in the room and others, have grants from the Race Equity and Philanthropy Fund, which was capitalized by Ford and Kellogg. And so the fund that Christelle just mentioned is kind of a corollary, which is investing in capacity building for nonprofit organizations. So for those of us who are in philanthropy or philanthropy serving, we know there is a huge disparity in the funding available to invest in race equity capacity building for foundations and philanthropy serving organizations versus nonprofits, which is in and of itself a reflection of structural racism. So the necessity for this fund is critical, and it's a phenomenal resource that we all know is much needed. And there it is. But we'll definitely include information in follow-up. So in closing, I say thank you for joining us for the past day and a half. Thank you to Heather, to all of our other presenters, Edgar Villanueva, the workshop presenters, and to each of you for coming into this space that we held, being vulnerable and courageous, and learning together. And we hope to see you next time.